they say your life flashes before your eyes when someone dies. For me, it wasn't my life, it was his secrets. My name is Claire Morgan, and I used to believe I understood the meaning of love, or at least the version of love that fits inside marriage vows, mortgage payments, and Sunday dinners, where the same jokes are told over and over again. I'm 40 years old, a high school English teacher in a small Vermont town, the kind where the grocery clerk knows your brand of coffee, and the librarian sets aside books she thinks you'll like before you even ask. Until last fall, I was married to Mark. 15 years. 15 slow, quiet, ordinary years that I once called steady. Though now I think steady was just another word for stuck. Mark was the kind of man who moved through life like a checklist. Good job, decent house, loyal wife. He wasn't cruel or loud or even particularly interesting, but he was safe. And when you grow up in a house where love sounds like slammed doors and broken dishes, safety feels like a miracle. So I married it. We didn't have kids. Sometimes that was my fault. Sometimes it was his, depending on which year you asked. We stopped trying after our 5th anniversary. Life slipped into routine coffee at 6:30, his car leaving the driveway at 7, dinner at 7:15, the same plates, the same conversations, the same goodnight kiss that tasted like toothpaste and fatigue. And yet, if you'd asked me then, I would have said I was happy, or close enough to it. Everything changed on a Thursday. The date is carved into me now, October 12th. It was a chilly morning, the kind where you can see your breath against the kitchen window. I remember because I just poured my 2nd cup of coffee and was grading essays about The Great Gatsby. There was a line one student wrote, "Maybe dreams only matter until we wake up." I circled it, planning to comment later. Then the phone rang, the kind of ring that makes your stomach tighten before you even answer. "Mrs. Morgan?" The voice was male, official, polite in that distant way people are when they don't want to say the next sentence. "Yes? This is Officer Daniels from the Vermont State Police. Are you at home right now?" "Yes," I said, my hand tightening around the mug. "Is something wrong?" There was a pause, the kind that rearranges the rest of your life. "There's been an accident," he said. "Your husband, Mark Morgan. I'm so sorry, ma'am. He didn't make it." I remember the words, but not the moment after. I think I sat down, but maybe I didn't. The mug hit the floor. I know that because I heard it shatter. Everything after that happened on autopilot. The drive to the hospital, the kind nurse who said, "Take your time," the room that smelled like antiseptic and finality. Mark lay there, still wearing his work jacket, his hands folded too neatly. I stared at the face I'd kissed goodnight for 15 years, waiting for something. Tears, screams, rage, but there was only quiet. Just quiet. That silence followed me home, into every corner of the house we'd built together. His shoes by the door, his half-empty mug on the counter, the mail still unopened. Grief is strange. It doesn't hit all at once. It seeps in like water under a door. People came and went, bringing casseroles, saying things like, "He was a good man," and time heals everything. I nodded, thanked them, and felt nothing. 3 days after the funeral, I started sorting through his things, not because I was ready, but because the stillness was unbearable. I opened his closet, folded shirts that still smelled like his cologne, and stacked them in boxes. That's when I found it, the 2nd phone. It was tucked inside the pocket of an old jacket I didn't recognize. A newer model than his regular phone. No scratches, no case. It lit up as soon as I pressed the button, no password, no fingerprint lock. And there it was, another version of my husband's life, hidden behind a glowing screen. There were photos of places he'd never mentioned, dinners he'd never told me about. A few were blurry, but some were sharp enough to feel like a punch. Mark at a beach I'd never been to, smiling in a way he hadn't in years. And then there were messages. Hundreds of them. At first, I thought they were work-related, some side project or group chat. But then I saw the name, Ella. The texts were warm, intimate, careless. The kind of language that comes easy when you think you'll never be caught. I miss you already. When are you finally going to tell her? I don't want to hide anymore. My hands trembled, but not from shock. It felt like reading someone else's life entirely, one that had been playing in the background of mine for who knows how long. I should have cried. I should have thrown the phone. But instead, I just sat there, scrolling through months, maybe years of conversations, realizing that every time he'd been working late, he'd been with her. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the effort, the deliberate secrecy, the second phone, the new jacket, the life planned around lies. The final message from Ella was dated the day before he died. It said, "When are you finally telling her? I'm tired of waiting." That night, I placed the phone on the kitchen table and stared at it until sunrise. The grief I thought I felt turned into something sharper, not anger, not yet, but a cold kind of clarity. When morning came, I brewed coffee, just 1 cup this time, and realized that my marriage had died long before Mark ever did. And that was the moment I stopped being his wife. After that night, the phone stayed on the kitchen table like a loaded weapon, small, silent, dangerous. I didn't touch it for a full day. I went to work, taught Shakespeare, smiled when I had to, and came home to find it exactly where I'd left it. It glowed faintly in the dark, like it was waiting for me. When you've lived your life wrapped in routine, breaking it feels like stepping off a cliff. That's how it felt when I finally picked it up again. My thumb hovered over the email app, a blue envelope icon that I recognized but had never seen on his phone. The inbox was full. Most were exchanges between Mark and Ella. Some were short, a single word, an emoji. Others were pages long, confessions written in digital ink. He'd shared everything with her. His frustrations with work, his loneliness, even his complaints about me. I scrolled through hundreds of messages, and with each one, another version of my marriage unraveled. In one email, he wrote, "She doesn't understand me anymore. We barely talk. I feel invisible in that house." Invisible. That word stayed with me. I'd spent 15 years making sure he had what he needed: warm meals, clean clothes, quiet when he wanted it, and still, somehow, I was invisible. I stared at that line for a long time, wondering when exactly he'd stopped seeing me. Ella wrote back, "You deserve to be seen. You deserve happiness. Maybe it's time to stop living half a life." Half a life. That's what we'd both been living, I realized, only I didn't know I was the half he'd already left behind. There were pictures of them together, a weekend trip to Maine, dinners in hidden restaurants, a hotel room with matching wine glasses on the nightstand. It wasn't lust or a one-time mistake. It was a second relationship, fully formed, carefully maintained. In one folder, there was even a rental agreement, his name and hers, listed as tenants for a small apartment in Burlington. The date started next spring. He had a plan. He wasn't just cheating. He was leaving. That was the part that hurt the most. Not that he'd found someone else, but that he'd already built an escape route. He had a future without me, drawn out in quiet, secret details, and all the while, I was still packing him lunches and asking if he'd remembered to pay the electric bill. I kept scrolling, reading, until the lines started to blur together. Somewhere between December and March, their tone changed from excitement to frustration. She wanted him to tell me. He kept delaying it. Soon, he'd write. After the holidays. She's not in a good place right now. End quote. I wondered if that was his excuse every time I looked too tired or sad. And then came the last message, the one I'd seen before. When are you finally telling her? I'm tired of waiting. That was dated October 11th, the night before the accident. I don't know if he ever replied. For hours, I stared at the screen, waiting for some surge of anger or grief. But instead, I felt something else: clarity. The kind that only comes when the truth leaves no more room for lies. I walked through our house, my house, now, and saw everything differently. The photos on the wall looked staged. The framed wedding picture on the mantel seemed almost mocking. Two smiling strangers promising forever, with eyes that didn't know what forever cost. It wasn't that my love had disappeared. It was that it had finally run out of places to live. Later that night, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop. I clicked Compose and typed Ella's email address into the to-line. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I was calm, colder than I'd ever been in my life. The cursor blinked at me, waiting. I could have written paragraphs, accused her, cursed him, begged for answers. But instead, I wrote just one sentence. You can have him now. Then I pressed send. That was it. I expected some kind of release, an explosion, a breakdown, something cinematic. But all that came was silence. The kind that fills every inch of a room until it becomes almost comforting. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to protect. The next morning, I deleted the emails, powered off both phones, and put them in a drawer. Not to forget, but to contain. The lies had lived there long enough. I wouldn't let them live in me too. In the following days, I noticed small things I'd ignored before. The way sunlight hit the kitchen window, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own breath. I started cooking meals just for me, ones he didn't like. I played music while I graded papers. People at school kept saying how strong I was being. I didn't feel strong. I just felt awake. That's what happens when the illusion breaks. The world doesn't end. It just becomes brutally honest. Mark had lived a second life, one built on secrets and escape plans. But I was the one who ended it, not by exposing him, not by revenge, but by refusing to carry his deceit any further. In the end, the truth didn't destroy me, it set me free. And that's the strange thing about betrayal. It doesn't just take something from you, it also gives something back. A kind of clarity you never had before. I didn't reply when Ella eventually wrote back. Her email came 3 days later. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. I deleted it without opening it again. Because by then, I already understood. Some apologies aren't for the person you hurt, they're for the person trying to forgive themselves. And I wasn't responsible for her peace. That was the moment I realized mine had already begun. After I hit send, I sat back in my chair and watched the screen go blank, the faint reflection of my face staring back at me from the glass. It was the first time I'd looked at myself properly in months, maybe years. My hair was messy, my eyes ringed with exhaustion. But behind that, there was something else. Not anger, not grief, something steadier, something that felt like my own pulse coming back after years of being muted under his rhythm. The silence in the house stretched long and deep, like a pause between 2 lives. For 15 years, every sound in that house had revolved around him, his footsteps, his voice, his keys on the counter, the creak of his side of the bed. Now there was only me, and the quiet was so complete it was almost musical. I didn't cry, I didn't even sigh. I just sat there, feeling the weight of that single sentence settle into place like the final piece of a puzzle. You can have him now. 4 words. That was all. I didn't plan them. I didn't analyze them. They came from somewhere honest and unedited, from the part of me that had grown tired of carrying the burden of a man who had already left long before his death. Those words were my closure, short, clean, final. The kind of ending he never gave me. The next morning, the world looked different. I woke up earlier than usual. I made my own coffee, stronger than he liked it, and drank it standing by the window. The maple tree outside had turned orange overnight, its leaves scattering across the lawn like tiny pieces of fire. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone or fill the silence with anything. It's strange. The things you notice when you stop living for someone else. The clock ticking, the warmth of sunlight through thin curtains, the sound of a bird tapping at the window. I had spent years ignoring small pleasures because they didn't fit into the rhythm of our marriage. We were always too busy, too tired, too focused on the next thing that was supposed to make life meaningful. But standing there that morning, I realized meaning wasn't something you built with another person. It was something you found in the stillness after they were gone. That day, I went through his things again not to punish myself, not to torture myself, but to understand the scale of the life I'd been living blind to. In his desk drawer, I found a stack of old receipts, restaurants in towns he told me he'd never visited, a jewelry box with a silver bracelet that wasn't mine, letters from his insurance company, some unopened, a whole archive of tiny betrayals disguised as paperwork, and beneath it all, at the bottom of the drawer, was our wedding album. I flipped through it slowly. The smiles looked real, but now that I knew what I knew, I could see at the distance in his eyes, the faint edge of something guarded even then. I closed the album and slid it back into the drawer. It didn't belong on display anymore. I went outside and stood on the porch, breathing in the cold air. The world felt bigger without him in it, but also heavier, like I was holding something delicate and dangerous at once. My own life, untouched and uncertain. When the mail arrived that afternoon, there was a letter addressed to him. I opened it without guilt. It was from a travel agency confirming a reservation for 2 flights to Italy, dated for April. He'd been planning a new beginning, just not with me. I should have been furious, but all I felt was distance. The letter, the plans, the emails, they weren't my burden anymore. They belonged to the man I'd buried and to the woman he'd left behind in messages. They were remnants of a story I no longer had to finish. That night, I took both his phones out to the backyard. I didn't destroy them. I just buried them beneath the oak tree. It wasn't about revenge or erasing evidence. It was a symbolic burial laying to rest not just him, but the version of myself who'd lived in his shadow. I whispered, "You can have him now." Again, softer this time, not to Ella, but to the air itself. And as I said it, I realized I meant something different. Not you as in another woman, but you as in the world, fate, life itself. You can have him now. I'm done holding on. In the days that followed, small pieces of myself began to return. I stopped wearing my wedding ring. I started reading novels again, stories that had nothing to do with betrayal or loss. Just ordinary fiction about people finding pieces of joy in unexpected places. I cleaned out the closet, gave away his clothes, sold his car. Each act felt like a quiet reclaiming. I didn't tell anyone about the mistress, not my sister, not my best friend, not even the grief counselor who called to check on me. Some truths are too private, too heavy to hand over to anyone else. And honestly, I didn't need sympathy. I didn't want to be seen as the betrayed wife the poor woman left behind. I wasn't left behind. I'd simply been set free without notice. Freedom, I was learning, isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't arrive in grand gestures or triumphant music. It arrives quietly, in the way you start breathing easier, in the way food starts to taste again, in the way silence stops feeling like punishment. A week later, Ella sent another email. This time, it was longer. She said she hadn't known he'd die that night. She said she loved him, but she was sorry for the pain it caused me. She said she hoped I could forgive him one day. I read it once, calmly, then deleted it. There was nothing left to say. Forgiveness wasn't something I needed to give. It was something I was already living in. Every breath, without bitterness, was forgiveness enough. What surprised me most in those weeks wasn't the absence of him. It was how easily life filled the space he left. I started staying late at school, talking to students, helping them edit their essays. I cooked dinner just for myself and actually sat down to enjoy it. I even laughed one night, an unexpected, startling laugh at some old comedy rerun on TV. And when I heard it, I realized how long it had been since I'd laughed at all. That laugh didn't erase the pain, but it reminded me of something vital. I was still alive. And being alive, truly alive, was something Mark hadn't been for years. He'd been running from himself, from our life, from the quiet truths that scared him. When he died, I thought I'd lost everything, but the truth was, what I lost was the illusion. What remained was the woman I'd forgotten to be. Sometimes, when I walked into the kitchen, I caught myself glancing at the spot where his coffee mug used to sit. At first, it hurt. Then, gradually, it didn't. The emptiness became familiar, like a scar that stops aching but never disappears. You can have him now, I'd think again. And each time I repeated it, it meant something new, something lighter. It wasn't bitterness anymore. It was release. Months later, when the snow started to fall, I went for a walk through town. The Christmas lights were up, glowing faintly through the flakes. I passed couples holding hands, families laughing, and for the first time, I didn't feel envy. I just felt peace. Because here's what I learned. Some endings come disguised as heartbreak, but they're really beginnings in their truest form. When you lose what you thought you needed, you make space for who you really are. That single email didn't just end a secret. It ended my silence. And in that silence, I found the start of everything I'd been missing myself. It started slowly. Freedom, I learned, doesn't come all at once. It creeps in like morning light through half-open curtains. For weeks after I sent that email, I went through the motions of my life like someone walking barefoot through a field she's crossed 1,000 times but never really seen. At first, the quiet felt strange. There was no clatter of his keys, no sound of the garage door, no voice asking what was for dinner. The silence pressed against me until I decided to press back. The first thing I did was repaint the living room. It sounds small, but for 15 years, Mark had insisted on beige neutral, he called it. Practical. I chose deep green. Forest green, the color of pine after rain. I moved furniture, dragged heavy chairs across the floor, opened windows wide. The air smelled like new beginnings and paint thinner. When I stepped back, streaks of color still wet, I laughed under my breath. Not a bitter laugh. The kind that comes from realizing no one can stop you from doing something as simple as changing your own walls. That night, I slept with the windows open. The cold air touched my face, and I dreamed nothing at all. The next weekend, I sold his car. The dealer offered less than it was worth, but I didn't care. Watching the taillights disappear down the road felt like cutting the last thread of a web I hadn't realized was holding me still. Without his car in the driveway, the house looked lighter, roomier. Even the garden seemed to breathe differently. After that, I started making small choices I'd always postponed. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. I bought fresh flowers for the kitchen every Friday. I began walking after dinner, sometimes just around the block, sometimes for miles, until my lungs ached in a good way. At school, people still looked at me with that soft, careful sympathy reserved for widows. I didn't correct them. I let them think I was grieving a perfect man. It was easier than explaining that what I'd really lost was a cage made of habit. Every day, I felt the weight lift a little more. It wasn't joy exactly, more like lightness, the slow loosening of something that had been tight for too long. I started noticing myself again. The way my hair caught sunlight, the curve of my handwriting, the things that made me laugh when no one was around. I hadn't realized how small I'd made myself in our marriage, always shrinking a bit to keep peace, to fit the version of us he needed. One evening in November, I came home from school and sat on the porch steps. The air was sharp with the smell of pine and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, kids were laughing, their voices echoing against the hills. I wrapped my arms around my knees and watched the sun go down. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel alone. I felt solitary, and there's a difference. Alone is emptiness. Solitary is ownership. Inside, I made dinner nothing special, just pasta and a glass of wine. But I ate slowly, savoring every bite, something I'd rarely done before. Mark used to eat quickly, always checking his phone, always halfway out the door even when he was sitting right in front of me. Now there was no rush. One night, while cleaning out the hallway closet, I found an old box labeled Summer Trip 2008. Inside were photos from our first vacation together. We looked so young, careless, sunburned, happy. I stared at one picture for a long time, him holding my hand at the edge of the sea, both of us laughing at something I can't remember. For a moment, I felt a tug of sadness, not for the man he became, but for the illusion of who I thought he was. I realized then that it's possible to mourn a memory and not the person attached to it. I put the box back, closed the closet, and felt something unclench in my chest. A few days later, I started running again. I hadn't done it in years. The first morning was brutal. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but by the second week, I could make it to the park without stopping. Running gave me rhythm again, something to match my heartbeat to. One morning, after a long run, I sat on a bench by the lake. The surface was perfectly still, the reflection of the sky clear enough to look like another world. I thought about how Mark used to hate stillness. He always needed noise, TV, radio, conversation. I used to match that energy just to keep him comfortable. But now, I found comfort in the silence. I realized something there, watching the water. The quiet I once feared was never emptiness. It was space. Space to breathe. Space to exist without explanation. That realization settled over me like a warm blanket. I stopped waiting for closure to arrive from someone else. Closure, I discovered, wasn't an event, it was a decision. It was choosing to stop chasing answers from people who never deserved the questions. In December, I took a week off work. I drove up to the mountains alone, rented a small cabin, and brought nothing but books and a notebook. The snow fell endlessly outside, soft and steady. I spent most of those days writing letters I never planned to send. To him, to myself, to the woman I'd been at 30, who thought love meant endurance, who believed silence was safety. I told her she was wrong. I told her it's okay to want more than peace. It's okay to want joy. By the time I drove back home, the roads were clear and my chest felt lighter. I stopped wearing black. I stopped pretending to mourn. I started living the way people do when they finally realize no one else is keeping score. Every act of moving forward, no matter how small, was a quiet rebellion. I didn't need grand transformations. I just needed to keep choosing myself, day after day, until it became natural. In January, I got a postcard from one of Mark's old friends. He didn't know the details. He just wrote, "Thinking of you." Mark was lucky. I stared at that last line for a while and finally smiled, because maybe he had been lucky to be loved deeply, despite everything. And maybe I was lucky too to have learned, in the hardest way possible, that love shouldn't cost you your own reflection. That evening, I made a small fire in the backyard. I burned the last of our old bills, the rental agreement with Ella's name, and a few photographs that no longer meant anything. I didn't do it with anger. I did it with calm. Watching the papers curl into ash felt like exhaling a breath I'd been holding for 15 years. When the flames went out, the night was quiet again. I looked up at the stars and whispered to myself, "It's over." And it was. The weight had lifted, not all at once, but piece by piece, until one morning I woke up and realized I wasn't waiting for the pain to end anymore. It already had. I was no longer the woman who sent that email in grief. I was someone new, someone lighter, someone unafraid of her own company. Freedom hadn't come with fireworks or forgiveness. It came with stillness, with breathing, with simply being. And maybe that was the truest form of liberation after all. A full year passed before I visited the lake again, the same one where we used to drive on Sundays, where he'd skip stones across the water and I'd sit quietly beside him, pretending not to notice when his mind drifted elsewhere. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Every time I thought about it, something in me resisted, like walking into a place where ghosts still breathed. But on the anniversary of his death, I woke up before dawn, packed a thermos of coffee, and drove there anyway. The road was empty, the air brittle with early autumn cold. The trees lining the highway were half bare, their leaves scattered like faded confetti. As I drove, I realized I didn't feel dread anymore. There was no heaviness in my chest, no tightening in my throat, just a calm acceptance, like walking into a familiar room that had been rearranged while you were gone. When I reached the lake, fog hovered above the water in soft white ribbons. The world was quiet except for the occasional sound of geese lifting off from the far shore. I parked, wrapped my coat tighter, and walked down the worn path to the edge. It was strange, standing there again. Everything looked the same. The curve of the water, the way light rippled across the surface, but I wasn't the same woman who used to come here. That version of me had lived her life orbiting someone else's gravity. This one stood on her own ground. I poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cold morning air, and sat on the old wooden bench. My hands didn't shake. My mind didn't wander to what-ifs. Instead, I found myself thinking about the woman I had become in the space his absence created. After he died, I thought my life would shrink, that I'd be defined forever as the widow, the betrayed wife, the woman with the scandal buried under polite silence. But life has a way of expanding when you finally stop fighting it. In the past year, I had done things I never thought I would. I'd taken a solo trip to Maine and spent 3 days walking along the coast, eating dinner alone in small restaurants, watching sunsets without the need to share them with anyone. I'd started a writing group at school, helping students tell their own stories, and for the first time, I started writing mine. I bought a dog, a rescue mutt named Daisy, who followed me everywhere. I learned to fix things around the house myself. I even planted a garden, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or permission for. The first bloom of lilacs that spring had felt like a quiet victory. It wasn't that life was perfect. It wasn't. There were lonely days, restless nights, moments when I caught myself reaching for something, someone who wasn't there. But I no longer saw those moments as weakness. They were reminders of how far I'd come. I had stopped being afraid of solitude. I had stopped needing validation. I had learned how to fill my own silence with purpose. Sitting by the lake that morning, I pulled a small piece of paper from my coat pocket. I had written it the night before, without really planning to. It wasn't long, just a single sentence. "Thank you for leaving me." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't bitterness. It was truth. Because if he hadn't left emotionally first, physically after, I might never have found the courage to meet myself again. I weighed the paper in my hand, then set it on the bench beside me. The wind picked it up gently, carried it toward the water, and I watched it drift away until it vanished. For a long while, I just sat there, watching the ripples spread. Somewhere in the distance, a family arrived, 2 kids running toward the dock. A woman calling after them. I smiled. There was a time when that sight would have made me ache with what I didn't have. Now, it simply looked like life, messy, loud, beautiful life, continuing as it should. Before leaving, I took one last look at the lake. The reflection of the sky shimmered across it, soft and endless. I thought about the version of me who used to come here with him, how she'd always sat a little too still, afraid to break the peace, afraid to disturb what little connection she thought she had left. If she could see me now standing here, shoulders back, unafraid, she wouldn't recognize herself. And maybe that was the point. Back in the car, I turned on the radio for the first time in months. A song I didn't know played softly, some slow acoustic melody about moving on. I didn't change it. I didn't analyze it. I just let it fill the air. As I drove home, I realized something simple and profound. I no longer needed closure from him, from Ella, from anyone. Closure had already arrived quietly in the spaces I'd reclaimed my home, my voice, my peace. When I reached my driveway, Daisy bounded up to greet me, tail wagging, eyes bright. I knelt down, buried my hands in her fur, and felt an unexpected swell of gratitude for her, for the house that was mine, for the life that had finally become mine. That night, I sat at my desk, opened a blank document, and began to write, not about him, but about me, about everything that came after the storm, about the quiet strength of a woman who refused to break even when the world expected her to. As the words filled the page, I realized that every chapter of my life from now on would begin with the same truth. I am no longer waiting for permission to exist. The next morning, sunlight poured into the house. I brewed coffee, opened the window, and stood there watching the world wake up. The birds were loud, the air smelled like rain, and I smiled for no reason other than the fact that I could. It had taken me a year to understand that liberation isn't dramatic, it's quiet. It doesn't shout. It hums softly beneath the surface of everyday moments. A painted wall, a morning walk, an empty bed that doesn't ache anymore. I wasn't the woman he betrayed. I wasn't the woman he left. I wasn't even the woman who wrote, "You can have him now." I was someone new, someone free. And as the sunlight warmed my face, I whispered to myself, "You did it. You came back." Because I had come back, not to him, not to the life we'd built, but to myself. And that was the real ending. The kind that doesn't need to be written in an email. The kind that lives quietly in the heart long after the last goodbye.